General, it's great to see you today.
Thank you very much, Jason, for the privilege.
So, General, there's a lot been going on recently, and you've seen the past couple weeks. Ukraine is taking the war to Russia. It's been attacking targets inside of Russia. What do you make of that? Is that part of a larger strategy, or what's happening?
Well, I think always you want to get the initiative from the enemy, have the enemy react to you versus always having to react to the enemy. And secondly, the Operation Spider's Web was is part of a larger effort to do that. Specifically, it's also a classic example of killing the archer, going after those bombers, which have been delivering cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians, has helped degrade Russia's ability to continue those attacks. So they killed a lot of the archers, which is always better than just trying to intercept all the incoming arrows. The third thing about it that really impressed me was how deep Ukraine was able to penetrate into Russia. And this has to be a real headache for the Kremlin because now people, Russians, can see that not 1 square kilometer of Mother Russia is safe from being hit. Everywhere is within reach. And so not only does that create problems for force protection, you start dispersing your aircraft, which makes it more difficult to mass them for attacks or to do maintenance. It also forces you to scatter or disperse your air defense assets. And then, of course, it adds to the mistrust. And, every truck is getting stopped now, and all over Russia, people are starting to wonder what's going on. How are these attacks happening? So I think what Ukraine is doing is getting the initiative, creating psychological problems and security problems inside of Russia.
That's really interesting. So, where does it go from here? If Ukraine continues to strike within Russia, it's not only hitting the bombers, but also the factories to produce things, such as the Shahed drones. Where do you think they'll take it? Will they just continue this cycle? And can Russia get back on its feet? Does it have enough air defense to stop this? Because it's going to have to call back resources from Ukraine. But will that really change anything?
I think that Ukraine still has a lot of cards, if I may say. I don't think that what happened with the spider's web that's it. Okay, now it's back to normal jogging. I think that land forces are going to continue to have a tough fight against Russian forces around the entire line of contact. But my sense is that Ukraine is going to continue attacking inside of Russia, going after these similar targets, going after Russia's ability to conduct, to sustain long-term warfare. And also, I imagine we'll continue to see attacks on the oil and gas infrastructure because degrading Russia's ability to generate income from oil export is just as important as shooting down or destroying bombers or killing Russian infantry, maybe even more so. So that's my expectation. And what we are seeing, of course, is an increase in the ability of Ukraine's defense industry to produce what they need. And countries like Germany have indicated that they plan to invest more into Ukraine's defense industry. So I think this is a positive trend.
So let's talk about the oil industry. That's really interesting. Russia has a fleet of ships that it sends around the world, and this ghost fleet is shipping the oil. Now, that's obviously in violation of US sanctions and European sanctions. If we had the willpower, could we stop those ships? Do we have the military capacity to do so?
Yeah, this is a thing that it really is a matter of political will and then some coordination. I mean, 70% of Russia's oil exports go to China and India. So, of course, China and India would not be happy if they started having to pay a lot more for get oil from somewhere else, or if their supply is disrupted. So nations would have to work together and think through the implications of this. And unfortunately, the U.S. administration shows no interest in helping to do this. But nonetheless, you've got allies. Every country in the Baltic Sea except Russia is a NATO ally, and they are also all members of the European Union. So they could work together and protect each other and stop these shadow fleet vessels, which, as the EU sanctions chief describes them as end of life ships. So they're already in bad shape. They're an environmental disaster waiting to happen if there's an accident. And so far, everyone that has been stopped has a list as long as your arm of violations of safety, insurance, etc. So stop these vessels and make it very difficult for them to do it. Now, of course, what could happen is what happened last week when the Estonian, or 2 weeks ago, when the Estonians were about to stop one, and then the Russian Air Force showed up, violating Estonian airspace, and prevented the Estonians from seizing that vessel. So this is where nations working together could in fact do something like that, but be prepared for Russia's very unhappy reaction. The Black Sea is a little bit more problematic because Turkey, which has been a very strong supporter of Ukraine, still is very, very careful about how they manage things under their authority with the Montreux Convention of what goes in and out of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. So a little bit more difficult to start uh, to begin to stop shadow fleet vessels coming out of there. But I think there are things that could be done, but Turkey would have to be confident that other nations would support them when Russia bites back.
So, speaking of that region, it looks like oil prices now are surging, specifically because of Israel's attacks within Iran, which have started to destabilize the regime there. Now, that means that there's going to be probably even higher prices, which more people will buy Russian oil. So, it'll be harder to get countries like China off of this oil. So, going ahead, what is the strategy? How is it that we can both hurt the Russian economy while recognizing the fact that the prices are simply surging? It's going to be harder and harder to get people to go for an alternative.
Yeah, this is an excellent question and a good reminder of how all these conflicts are interconnected. These are not isolated conflicts with Ukraine and Russia, the Middle East, China. All of these are interconnected. And it's unfortunate that the United States is not playing a leading, helpful role. Um, you and I have talked about this before, that if you looked at Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China as four separate threat or four interconnected threats, and had a strategy that connected them, that if you help Ukraine defeat Russia first, that would lead to the isolation of Iran because Iran has no other friends. And then China would probably be deterred by what they would see in terms of Western will and capacity and capabilities. Instead, the United States has pretty much sided with Russia almost completely. And the Europeans are still slowly starting to get their act together to figure out how they can combine their efforts. And then, of course, the Israelis, I think, did not wait for the U.S. to give them a go ahead before they attacked Iran. It's still not too late for the United States to assert itself and say, look, here's what we're going to do. We want to see the end of Iran's nuclear capability, but we also want oil prices to go down, number one, because we don't want inflation in the United States. But number two, we do not want Russia to benefit from rising oil prices. That's the opposite of what we want when it comes to Russia. Um, but we're just not seeing that, and I don't get any sense that the United States is prepared to do that. So this is where Europe, which has the capacity, it just doesn't have the political will yet to make these hard decisions and to be willing to take the heat that will surely come from Russia, China, and maybe even the Trump administration. It'll be instructive to see what comes out of the G7, which just started up in Canada here over the next couple of days, because President Zelensky, of course, has been invited there, as have several other leaders, in addition to the seven leaders of the G7 countries. Um, Trade deals, Ukraine, all of these will be some of the topics that are covered there.
Well, I certainly want to talk about the G7 in Europe. Let me ask you one more question about Iran. It seems that Israel has been attacking targets that were military in nature, of course, and the defense industries. Now, that might have a secondary effect, is that a lot of those things were going to Russia as well. So Russia was benefiting from them. And though Russia has had the capacity to assemble Shahed drones, for instance, it does not have the components necessary to do it by itself. In fact, it relies still on Iran for many things. And some people say that China is unlikely to step in to help because simply they're not willing to risk the tariffs or the sanctions that would come from that. What do you think?
You may be better informed than me, but I swear I thought I read yesterday that Russia was now producing, not just assembling, but producing Shahed drones. And so the loss of Iran as a source might not be that significant a blow, but um, I would defer to you on that. Uh, this is an interesting kind of multifaceted problem, though, because um, with Iran being so unstable, oil prices go up, which helps Russia. But the Russians, of course, have relied on Iran and the ability to go through the Caspian, then across Iran, and then out to the Indian Ocean as a way to avoid NATO countries or EU countries disrupting what they're trying to do. So it would not be to Russia's advantage if the regime collapses or if it's in a chaotic sort of state like it is right now, at least seemingly so. Um, the other thing that's interesting, Russia has done nothing to help Iran, just like they did nothing to help Syria and they did nothing to help Armenia. So Russia is turning out to be not a very good ally either, perhaps because they don't really care, or perhaps they are so overstretched. This could be an indicator of Russia's weakness and the limits on their ability to do more than just fight against Ukraine.
That's interesting. So, what do you think the Europeans should be doing more of now? There's been a lot of talk about Germany stepping up. What do you see happening?
Yeah, I hate this phrase stepping up because it's kind of for as long as it takes, kind of a empty phrase. Specifically, and I am impressed with what the new German Bundeskanzler is doing, with the significant increase in defense investment, significant increase in infrastructure investment. He's taken a tough line of supporting Ukraine against Russia, unlike most of his predecessors. Um, and I think that Germany is beginning to finally lead by example. So if he and the French and the Brits and the Poles and the Finns and Italians can work together, you're talking about combined economies and defense industries that dwarf Russia. I mean, by several orders of magnitude. I think very clear statements coming from them about we want Ukraine to win. Not just we're with you for as long as it takes. We want Ukraine to win. We want Ukraine to be able to reestablish its sovereignty. And we're going to do and give everything necessary for that to happen. That kind of a strategic statement would be powerful. And then follow it up with hard economic actions, tightening up the sanctions, eliminating all the loopholes that are out there. There's a lot of people getting around sanctions still. Um, Using the frozen Russian assets to help pay for Ukraine's defense and also reconstruction, and then investing in Ukraine's defense. These are the kind of specific actions I would want to see from our European allies and Canada.
Looking at Ukraine's future defense or current defense, do you think that there'll be greater investment into Ukrainian defense industries? Do you see that as being something that's realistic for European countries to pursue?
I think that probably 10 years from now, Ukraine is going to be the defense industry heart of all of Europe, just the way it was the defense industry heart of the Soviet Union. You're going to have nations coming to Ukraine to buy, what they make, or at least creating joint ventures as part of a Europe rearming itself for the defense of its interests and its citizens. So Ukraine, I think, is a part of the security future for all of Europe, not just by having troops there that are experienced and that have defeated or stopped Russia, but actually defense industry. And that's why you're going to see, I believe, uh, some of the nations actually investing in Ukrainian defense industry. And of course, companies like Rheinmetall, as well as some others from other countries, BAE from the UK, for example, are partnering with or building their own facilities inside Ukraine.
So, looking at that, what's the future look like? How can Ukraine guarantee peace and make sure that Russia's not going to reinvade? What's necessary to do that? That's always going to be an option, isn't it? And isn't that part of why Crimea is so important?
Well, I think that, of course, the best way to make sure that Russia doesn't attack again is not only to defeat them, to push them back to the 1991 borders, including recovering Crimea as sovereign territory of Ukraine, but then arming them to the teeth, making sure that their defense industry is able to provide what it needs, that Ukraine has a large enough armed force that Russia would never want to make the terrible mistake of attacking again. Somebody referred to Ukraine as kind of the Silicon Valley almost for a place to experiment and develop new capabilities. That's exactly how we should be looking at it. And I think eventually, hopefully in my lifetime, Ukraine becomes a member of NATO and the European Union. Um, NATO will get better the day that Ukraine joins the alliance. But until then, I can see uh, building up Ukraine, continuing to build up, modernize Ukraine's forces. But Ukraine also has a responsibility here. They have got to fix their internal domestic issues, specifically having what we call the institutional army that recruits, trains, equips soldiers that go into the operational force. And that means that the government has got to earn the confidence of people that their sons and daughters will not get sent off to the war until they are properly trained, properly equipped, and put into a well-trained, ready unit.
So, what else is necessary for Ukraine to be better prepared, to have a military that meets Western standards?
Well, actually, it's not about meeting Western standards. Most NATO armies could not meet Ukrainian standards in terms of actual combat effectiveness. So, um, you know, interoperability, of course, is always a challenge. We still cannot communicate securely with British units or German units. So um, I think the Ukrainians kind of look down their noses at us a little bit. When they hear us, "Oh, we're going to come help train you," we should be begging them to help us learn how to do what they're doing. I mean that sincerely. Of course, the kinds of things where you really want to be integrated and you have to be integrated is air and missile defense, where everybody has a common air picture. So no matter what country you're in, you can see incoming missiles or air enemy aircraft. Ukrainians have developed that for themselves. Um, I would want to be confident that we have a shared picture between them, Poland, Baltic countries, Germany, the US, Romania, for example, Turkey, so that we're all looking at the same thing and that decisions about shoot, no shoot, are being done in a way that's integrated. And you're not going to waste patriots on drones. You're using the right weapon system against whatever the threat is. That's one thing. The second area where I think we want to be better integrated with Ukraine, of course, is in the maritime. They have shown the entire world that you can defeat a conventional navy, at least in an enclosed body of water like the Black Sea, without having to have capital ships of your own. So lots for us to learn there. And that may not apply in the Atlantic Ocean, but certainly in the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, these kind of things. I hope that we are paying close attention and figuring out how can we help Romania and Bulgaria, for example, grow their unmanned uh, maritime capabilities.
So let me ask you just one last question. There's been a lot of talk these days that Vladimir Putin realizes the war is not going well. And now there's more and more attacks within Russia that it could be something that's a challenge to his regime, something that might cause him to do something he hasn't done so far, such as use nuclear weapons. Do you see any benefit from him using nuclear weapons? And what do you think the Western response might be?
I see zero benefit for Russia to use a nuclear weapon. It's always been the threat of the use of a nuclear weapon that has been the most important capability they get through their nuclear force, because they could see that the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Schultz administration, the Brits, everybody else is concerned. Oh my God, if we do this, the Russians might use a nuclear weapon. They were never going to use a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, I can't guarantee that. They have thousands of nuclear warheads. They clearly do not care how many innocent people they may kill, including their own. But, as I try to imagine what are the different scenarios, anything other than something that looks like the survival of the motherland, it just seems very unlikely. And if they did it, then I think it would probably push some countries who are like, oh, we need to settle this. It would be hard for them. I mean, China, for example, has very clearly said, do not use nuclear weapons. India has said, do not use nuclear weapons to Russia. So I think that the Russians would uh, would get no benefit out of it. Previous administration, even though I criticize them a lot, I'm pretty sure that President Biden would have delivered catastrophic consequences for Russia if they did it. That doesn't mean that a nuclear weapon, but that they would have done something. I'm not so confident about the Trump administration, but other countries could, in fact, significantly increase either what they do for Ukraine or deliver some sort of counterstrike, not nuclear, that would make the Russians regret it.
What would that look like?
Well, I mean, there are places not inside Russia that are important to Russia. Those would be targets. What I would expect the U.S. administration to do would be prepared to launch significant strikes against any Russian forces outside of Russia, all around Ukraine, in Africa, any other places as a first strike. But this should come with a very strong warning, and I'm not talking about the empty warnings that the Trump administration has been given so far. I'm talking about you use a nuclear weapon, there's going to be devastating consequences, economic as well as kinetic and other things that you can't even imagine right now. And we're going to double what we're providing Ukraine, and we're going to do this. In other words, show that we're not going to be intimidated. If the United States and other countries can be deterred by just the threat of a tactical nuclear weapon, that's a terrible message to send to North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, China, obviously, and other countries that have or want to have a nuclear weapon.
General, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your service.
Thanks for the privilege, Jason.